Welcome to episode 369 of We Don't Die Radio. I'm your host, Sandra Champlain, author of the international best-selling book called We Don't Die, A Skeptic's Discovery of Life After Death. Our home base is wedon'tdie.com, where you can find all things afterlife, including attending one of our free online Sunday gatherings, complete with a medium demonstration in each and every one. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to a new friend who has contributed more than 20,000 articles to 50 newspapers, magazines, journals, and books for over 70 years, mostly in the sports arena, but listen to the titles of some of the books he's written. The Articulate Dead, The Afterlife Revealed, Transcending the Titanic, Resurrecting Leonora Piper, How Science Discovered the Afterlife, Dead Men Talking, Afterlife Communication from World War I, and his latest book, No One Really Dies, 25 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife. And I think you can see why I'm excited to say, Michael Tymn, welcome to We Don't Die Radio.
Well, thank you very much. But I wanted to correct you on that 20,000. It's not 20,000. It's 2,000 articles in about 50 magazines.
You know what? I'm excited to talk to you, so it was me that
Okay.
made the mistake.
No problem.
Well, happy to have you here, and you are in Hawaii, correct?
Right, Kailua, Hawaii.
Oh, how beautiful.
Yeah.
Opposite
Well,
side.
it's a nice place. I've lived here for 50 years. I'm from the San Francisco area originally, but I moved here in my early 30s, and outside of 4 years in Oregon, I've been here ever since.
A great place to call home.
Right. A little expensive, though.
Yeah, I would think so. Well, I'm fascinated because we haven't met yet, and I think we should have by now. So thankfully, our good friend Roberta Grimes introduced us. But if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how a nice man like you started investigating the afterlife, I think it's pretty amazing.
Okay, well, I didn't have a near-death experience or anything like that. It just sort of came upon me gradually. I grew up as a Catholic, stayed with the Catholic Church until I was about 30. Didn't feel I was getting much out of that, and tried a few Protestant churches, and came up blank there, and just sort of forgot about religion for the next 15 years or so, and then when I turned 50, I felt I've got to get involved with some religion. I need something in the way of spiritual teaching and so forth. And I really couldn't find. I read Dr. Moody's book on near-death experiences, and that was meaningful to me. But I just couldn't find a group or anything that appealed to me. But then I was, this is 1989, I was coach of the Hawaii team. They had a big national event in New York City. Each state had a team of runners running around Manhattan in a relay race, and I was the Hawaii coach. And just coincidentally, my wife had a conference in Atlanta, Georgia the same weekend. So as soon as the event was finished in New York, I jumped on a train and headed down to Atlanta to meet with her and drive around the South. But anyway, on the stopping in Washington, D.C., I got off the train and, shopped for a book to read the rest of the train ride, and I came upon one about reincarnation. I knew nothing about the subject. Anyway, I read that on the rest of the trip, and that started it all. I started looking for other books. I'm not big into reincarnation right now. I have a different view on reincarnation, but that started it all. I went from there to near-death experiences, and then to mediumship and deathbed visions and so forth. And it's just something that grew on me. And since I majored in journalism in college, I started writing about it about late 1990s, I guess. And after I retired from my regular job in 2002, I started writing more about it. The books came, and here I am.
Well, it seems like you have a huge passion. Oh, can we talk reincarnation just for a second? There is a debate on both sides, so I would just be happy to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, there are three or four different views of reincarnation. There's the Orthodox view, the one that says we live a life now, that we die, then we spend some time on the other side, 20 or 30 years or whatever, then come back as another personality. That's the Orthodox one, I call it. There's the group soul theory that says that we're all part of a group soul on the other side, and only a very small fraction of the personality comes back. The higher self, which is most of the personality, stays on the other side, and just a small part comes back. There's the possession one that says that the cases we hear about reincarnation are really low-level spirits possessing people, not necessarily low-level in the sense of being evil, but just unadvanced spirits that are taking over the person and making it seem as though, the person's reporting the past life. And there's the time element one that says that we live all lives at the same time. We're living past lives, present lives, and future lives all at the same time, which is very difficult to comprehend and is beyond me. And I like the number 2, group soul. I like it, and it's more a matter of emotion rather than reason, because I don't want to come back. I just don't want to start all over again. So it's more emotion rather than reason on my part.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's been a big debate upon our listeners and in our different groups and things. And some people believe that the person who claims to be reincarnated, they're just highly mediumistic and they're tapped into someone who did live. So that's one of the things that have thrown out there as well. Also,
well, that's the possession one.
Possession.
About, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah. But it's one thing that I believe is, if whatever empowers people to live a life here, take it. If it doesn't fit, don't. But when you think about how many more people are living on this earth than did hundreds of years ago, what would explain for all these other souls? So, anyways.
Yeah, I don't know. They've all been, over there in the afterlife and just gradually reincarnating. I don't know. I really haven't given that much thought to that. I just I was heavy into reincarnation those first few years, but I just haven't paid much attention to it in recent years.
Yeah.
My primary focus has been mediumship and deathbed visions and near-death experiences, but I've just avoided reincarnation as much as possible.
No, it's quite all right. I always get a mom who's had a child who's passed and think that they can't communicate with their child because they've reincarnated. And I say, oh, well, if that's the case, it would be many, many years down the road. But anyways, let's talk about what you're passionate about, because that's not one of my most passionate subjects either. What would you like to talk about? I know we had talked, you messaged a little bit about language, but what kinds of mediumship are you interested in? Because here we talk about physical mediumship, trance mediumship, and evidential mediumship.
Yeah, well, I'm mostly interested in the old mediumship as opposed to the clairvoyance that we hear about today. I mean, when you talk to people today, and they talk about mediumship, they're talking about John Edward or Lisa Williams or something, the things they've seen on TV, which is not the same as most of the mediumship of yesteryear. I put the time barriers as 1850 to 1920. I think that's when the best mediumship came through. The best psychical research took place between those years, and then after 1920, it started dying out, and parapsychology replaced psychical research during the 1930s, and they wanted nothing to do. Parapsychologists wanted nothing to do with life after death or spirits or anything else, and so it just sort of went away. Research into mediumships, and came back with Dr. Gary Schwartz in the and Julie Weichel in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but they were involved primarily with clairvoyance, not with trance mediums. We just don't have any real research that I know of going on with the mediums that I'm interested in, the ones before 1920. These days, there might be some, but I'm not aware of it.
Right. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that there's a legal doctrine or principle called res judicata. It means it has been adjudicated, and so my position is that the case for life after death was made before 1920. The doctrine of res judicata applies to it. It has been adjudicated. Everything that's come to us since 1920 in the way of near-death experiences, reincarnation studies, deathbed visions, whatever else adds to it. It's icing on the cake, but my position is that the case was made before 1920, but unfortunately it was just never recognized. It was resisted by both religion, Orthodox religion, and science, and so just and the media. So it was just never recognized, and very few people know about it. So that's been my purpose, is to try and resurrect all that old stuff in my 6 books, and bring it to the attention of people.
I like the old stuff. One of my good friends, Scott Milligan, he's a modern day physical medium and trance medium. We do trance demonstrations every Friday online. People can join us, and I've sat in dozens of his seances. And I, in the beginning, thought this can't possibly be real. It just seems to be something that's so far out of imagination. And I think a lot of people, when they hear a term like seance, ectoplasm, and those kind of things, they chalk it up to Ghostbusters and can't possibly be. But there were really men of science back in those days testing these mediums, right?
Right. Sir Oliver Lodge, who was a world-renowned physicist, is my favorite. Dr. James Hislop, who was a psychologist, is probably the best among them, the most involved from 1900 to 1920. Dr. Richard Hodgson, Professor William James of Harvard, half a dozen others I could name. They were all men of science or very esteemed scholars.
Well, I think the conversation's coming back, and I know myself, Roberta Grimes, and some others who know this to be true. We want to interview people like you to hear your story and what you've found. And there's always someone listening. In fact, more than someone, most people listening to this show have a loved one who's passed and are really looking for reasons to believe.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I met so many of them in my age. I'm 84 now, and so I've known a lot of people over the years. And my parents, I remember them. They were devout Catholics, went to Mass every Sunday, but they didn't want to. I tried to talk to them about this, and they didn't want to hear about it. It was as most of my Christian friends say, it's demonic. And the church says don't pay any attention to it. But one of the big things that I always point out to them is that they rely on Deuteronomy. It says there's something in Deuteronomy that says the dead know nothing, and you should not communicate with the dead. Well, the original Hebrew that was translated from said the spiritually dead know nothing. It was referring to earthbound spirits. Don't pay attention to earthbound spirits, not to all the dead. And then there are other passages in the Bible that says you should, discern the messages or whatever. I mean, how are you going to discern them if you don't listen to them in the first place? But there are 5 or 6 different passages that counter the idea that you shouldn't be speaking with the dead.
Right. I've talked to people who are biblical scholars, and they said how many times the Bible has been changed and what was said. And so I grew up Catholic myself, went to church every Sunday, went to Catholic school.
Yeah.
So it's probably the last thing a good Catholic girl would be doing is doing this. But I'm I'm here to empower people to have a good life and know the reality of the afterlife. So you had mentioned languages. I just want to hear some of your reasons why you believe in the afterlife, if you wouldn't mind sharing, because I know you have a book, your latest one, called "No One Really Dies: 25 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife." So you have a few.
Yeah. Well, 5 of the chapters I touch upon mediums who, through whom different languages came. I think that the first one was Laura Edmonds, who was the daughter of Judge John Edmonds, who was probably, I consider him the first real psychical researcher. He started researching mediums in 1850 after his wife died, and he was out to debunk them all. I guess that, so many people had told him, go to this medium, go to that medium, and so forth, and see if you can contact your wife. And he was a good Christian, and he just didn't buy into it. So his objective was to debunk them all. But he investigated for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, I forget the exact time, and he came to the conclusion that it was real. And during that time, his daughter, Laura, I don't know what her exact age was, but I think she was a teenager, she started speaking different languages. I have a list of them here: Spanish, French, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Latin, and Hungarian, some of the languages that came through her. And Judge Edmonds, in his book, he wrote the book, he and his co-author, Dr. George Dexter, wrote probably the first book, and it's one I'd really recommend. You can find it online, among used books. It's Spiritualism, Parts 1 and 2. He tells a little a time when his daughter was receiving messages from a young boy in Greece, or a boy in Greece who had just died, and passing the messages on to the father who was sitting there with her. The father didn't even know his son had died 3 days earlier, and this was coming through in Greek, which Laura didn't know. She didn't know any of the languages. She had taken a couple of classes in French in high school, but English and French were the only languages she knew. And as I said, the messages came through in Greek, and for others in Portuguese, Italian, Latin, Hungarian, whatever. So that's one. Etta Wright, her last name Wright, to me is probably the best medium on record. Her history is set forth by a British admiral who retired and became a psychical researcher, William Usbon Moore. He tells quite a bit about her in his 2 books, and she knew only one language, and he called it Yankee. She was from Detroit, Michigan, and she was a direct voice medium. A lot of people don't know the difference between direct voice and trans voice. Trans voice, a good example was Leonora Piper, where the voice actually came through her vocal cords. It usually changed. I mean, if a male was speaking, her voice changed completely from a feminine voice to a male voice. Not always, though. There are differences in that. But in the direct voice, the voice comes through usually 3 or 4 feet from the person. The medium, like Mrs. Wright, she could be talking to someone next to her while voices from 2 or 3 different spirits were coming through at the same time to different people sitting around her. But voices came through in French, German, Italian, Spanish, Norwegian, Dutch, Arabic, Serbian, and Croatian. So the skeptic might say, well, she knew all those languages. She just didn't let anybody know that she knew them. Yeah. How many people know Norwegian, Serbian, Croatian, can speak it fluently?
Not too many.
Yeah. So that to me, she's the best example. But there's others. Cora Scott, who to me is the most unknown, most fascinating medium from the from the 19th century. She started giving lectures at age 11 on every conceivable subject, scientific, philosophical, historical, political, subject she had never been exposed to. And some of them came through in foreign languages. In one case, she was addressing a deaf man, and she started giving messages to him in sign language, which she had never been, familiar with. So, and then also she was on tour in, this is later, not when she was a teenager, but in her early 30s, she toured the United Kingdom, and in Scotland, she started speaking in a very Scottish brogue. So what her biographer explains, that she was actually controlled by a group of 12 very knowledgeable spirits, that they took over her body when she was in a trance, and they were the ones speaking, not her. And so she's a, if you don't know much about Cora Scott, I'd suggest you find a book about her. I consider her the most fascinating of all of them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with her, so.
She also, Cora Scott Richmond, her married name was Richmond, so you probably might find more on Cora Scott Richmond. But there are others. The most famous one, the most difficult one to grasp, is George Valentine, who is said to have brought through Confucius, speaking in an ancient Chinese dialect. And this happened in New York. It's hard to believe, but we've got Professor Neville Wymant, who was a Oxford professor of languages, who wrote a book about it. He happened to be in New York at the time and was studying the languages of the American Indian. He is said to have been able to speak 30 different languages. He was contacted by Judge William Cannon, who was a New York judge at the time, and his wife was very much into having seances in her home, and had George Valentine over there on several occasions. And during those occasions, somebody started speaking in Chinese. Nobody knew what he was saying, and they weren't even sure it was Chinese. So anyway, Judge Cannon heard about Professor Wymant being in New York and asked him if he could come to his home and figure it all out. Well, Wymant was reluctant. I mean, he didn't know exactly what was going on, but he accepted the dinner invitation. And then, after dinner, they sat around in a little circle, and various voices came through in different languages. Wymant translated them, and then about the fifth or sixth one, I think it was in an ancient Chinese dialect. Well, Wymant knew modern Chinese dialect, and I guess from that he could figure out some of what the person was saying in the ancient Chinese dialect, and he asked him for an identity, and the person gave, I can't even remember Confucius' real name now, but he gave the name. Wymant thought it was some kind of joke. He couldn't figure out, who was playing a joke on him, but it just, he wasn't buying into it. But he kept questioning the spirit claiming to be Confucius. Wymant was also a Confucius scholar. He knew he could recite some of the Confucius poems and so forth. He started putting questions to him, and the Confucius changed from an ancient dialect to a modern dialect, and answered all the questions. Questions which Wymant said there are probably only 5 or 6 people in the world who would know the answers to those questions, but they came through. In fact, in one of them, the spirit recited 15 verses of a Confucius poem. So to suggest that the medium George Valentine, who was described as a very simple New Yorker, uneducated and so forth, studied ancient and modern Chinese dialects and 14 other languages that came through over the next 11 sittings, I think it was. Wymant sat with visited the Cannon home on 11 occasions, to suggest that Valentine studied all these languages and didn't let on that he knew them, and memorized the poems of Confucius and everything else, not knowing what was going to be asked of him at the time. That's a real stretch.
Yeah.
So, but it's so far out that people just are not prepared to accept that.
It's really hard to get your head around that could be possible. I believe it, and I can't imagine anybody would take that time to memorize and all that. But for a skeptic, that has to be the only explanation. We're taught when things seem too good to be true, they probably are, but not the case.
Yeah, but the other thing to remember here in the theory is that maybe it wasn't Confucius. Maybe it was a group soul representing Confucius. That's what Sir Oliver Lodge's theory was, that these group souls form on the other side representing certain schools of thought, including the Confucius school of thought, and that the communication was coming from the Confucius group soul, not from Confucius himself. So that's a possibility.
Either way, it represents there's something much bigger going on than meets the eye.
Right.
Wow. And now, will you tell us who Leonora Piper was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I wrote a book on Leonora Piper. To me, with the possible exception of Etta Wright, who I mentioned, she's probably the best medium on record and the most studied by the Society for Psychical Research. She was discovered supposedly by Professor William James of Harvard, around 1883 or 84, I think it was, and he was astounded. He was, a materialist for the most part at that time, and he didn't have time to really study her, so they arranged for Richard Hodgson, who was teaching in England at the time, to come over and manage the American Society for Psychical Research, and primarily his job was to study Mrs. Piper, which he did for 18 years. According to the records, he sat with her on the average of 3 times a week for 18 years. He started as a debunker. He was out to prove she was a fraud, but she, he quickly changed his mind that, this was the real deal. The only problem is that at that time, people just didn't want to believe that spirits were behind it all, so they theorized that a secondary personality was coming through her and giving all this information. It wasn't a spirit; it was she had multiple personalities, so to speak, and this other personality was somehow got hold of the information telepathically and was feeding it back to the sitter, the person that's sitting with her. So that was a real stretch. But the thing that really changed Hodgson on this, and changed others, including Sir Oliver Lodge, was in 1892, when a spirit who had been named George Pellew, Pellew. He was a member of the American Society for Psychical Research. He was a journalist and a lawyer as well, and he died at age 32 in a little accident, falling down some steps near his home in Manhattan. And about 6 weeks, I think it was, after he died, he began communicating with Hodgson through Mrs. Piper. Hodgson then arranged for people who knew Pellew to come and sit with Mrs. Piper. And over a period of time, he brought 30 different people who knew George Pellew. And each time, the person sat down, he wouldn't tell Leonora Piper who was coming or what the purpose was or anything else. I mean, she was blind as to who was sitting with her. Yet, when she'd go into a trance, and the voice would start speaking to her, George Pellew in this case. He'd welcome the person by name. Hi, Phil. How you doing? Or, hi, Jim. How you doing? Or something like that. So she immediately recognized, out of the 30 people that he brought to sit with Mrs. Piper, 29. He recognized 29 of them. The only one he didn't recognize was a woman who, she was a 12-year-old girl at the time, that she accompanied her mother to meet George Pellew. So she had grown from 12 to, I don't know how old she was at the time, 30 or whatever. So she was the only one he didn't recognize. But as soon as she told him who she was or who her mother was, he immediately remembered her mother and gave details about her mother. So pretty hard, 30 out of 30, to say that's fraud.
I would think so. Oh my gosh. And then in Dead Men Talking, Afterlife Communication from World War I, what did you find out there?
Yeah, actually, I took 6 different books and just summarized them. The primary one, here again, Sir Oliver Lodge. His son Raymond was killed in World War I, and began communicating with Sir Oliver and his wife through different mediums, including Gladys Osborne Leonard, who is known as the Mrs. Piper of England. And it was a very popular book in 1916, and it offered much evidential information from Raymond that, again, Sir Oliver was a famous physicist. He was also a professor of physics at, I can't think of the name.
That's okay.
I don't remember the name of the university, but anyway, he was very skeptical in the beginning, and there was no doubt in his mind that his son Raymond was communicating with him at the time. So that's the primary story in Dead Men Talking.
Oh, that's great. And what about Transcending the Titanic? Is that Afterlife based as well?
Yeah, it's primarily about William T. Stead, sometimes pronounced Steed, and his experiences after he was one of the passengers on the Titanic who went down with the ship, and he began communicating with various people after his death, and giving very evidential information. So it's mostly about him, but about how others approach death on the Titanic, some conversations they had and so forth. But I wrote that about 8 years ago, so I'm vague as to what I actually wrote right now.
That's not a problem at all. The fact that you've written, is it 8 books and 7 of them are of the afterlife? Something like that?
Yeah,
more or less.
7 afterlife books and one on distance running.
Wow. So it's okay. You've got a lot out there, what you remember, what you don't. Do you have any favorite stories from deathbed visitations or near-death experiences that you've researched?
Not. I have many, but I'm trying to think of.
I put you on the spot.
One I've talked to I've interviewed a number of people who've had near-death experiences. One I prefer not to mention his name, that died not too long ago, but he recalled having a life review, recalling every moment in his life, coming back to him, and this seems to be, have happened with a number of people who reported near-death experiences. They remember every moment of their life in detail. The story of Tom Sawyer has been written about, and he wrote a book himself, I think, and to me is one of the most impressive. That he recalled getting in a fight with he was driving his hot rod. I think he was 18 or 19 at the time. He was driving his hot rod and came to a stop and almost hit a pedestrian, an elderly man, and the elderly man started swearing at him, and I guess Tom jumped out of his car or whatever and hit the guy, and that came back to him in his life review, And in fact, he felt the punch himself. He felt his own punch coming in his face. And then he knew everything about the man. He knew the man at the time. His wife had just died, and he was, drinking, I guess, and there are other details that came through. That to me is one of the most impressive ones. But there have been other stories like that where people remember everything that ever happened to them during their lifetimes.
And they get to see their life from the impact they made on another person. I've heard that
right
so many times, like feeling that punch. And then I also find it very interesting that people have had near-death experiences. No matter when they have them, they're more vivid than any memory.
That's my understanding. And they remember many things they never even thought about during their lifetime. When you get to be my age, I spend a lot of time thinking about the past, what I might have done to change, take a different route or whatever, that something that didn't work out. But there are many things I don't remember. I happen to be cleaning out my my little library. I have a spare bedroom I call my library, and my parents kept every little letter I ever sent them from when I was in the military, and plus other things. They had 3 boxes of old letters, even from the 1920s, but when my father wrote to my mother and so forth. But anyway, I came upon a number of my letters and started reading them, and I was relating facts to them that I have no recollection of. I remember one that when I was in Quantico, Virginia, I told them I went to a football game with 2 friends, and after I came out of the game, my car wouldn't start, and I had to call AAA to get the car going. I had absolutely no recollection of that football game, no recollection of who the friends might have been or the car problem. It just got me to thinking that there's so much that's happened in my life that I have absolutely no memory of, but these things come back to you. I mean, not necessarily if there was no consequence to them, but so many of the near-death experiences remember little details that they wouldn't otherwise remember.
Yeah, amazing. Have you had any of your own friends or loved ones come through a medium? Or gotten signs?
In chapter 1 of my book, I talk about my George experience. I was in England with my wife. We were on vacation there, and we were going to drive started in London and drive all over the UK. And we started out the first or second day we were there. We decided to go for a walk outside of our hotel and walked about 3 or 4 blocks in one direction, and we saw an old Victorian home there, the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, and it had a little sign out there that said clairvoyant readings from at 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock every day. Well, it was about 2:30 the time we were on our walk, and so we decided to go in and see what it was all about. For the 3 o'clock reading, there were about 15 people, I guess, and it was held in the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle room. They had 3 different halls there in that Victorian home, and a middle-aged woman came in. She was a clairvoyant, and she started out with somebody in front saying, "I've got somebody here," saying his name is Richard, and he was with you. You were on a recent trip to Paris, and he was with you when you did this and that. And the person was nodding, yes, 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 I know who you're talking about. Yes, I just came back from Paris, and so forth. Well, this went on for 4 or 5 other people, and then she came to me and said, "I've got a George here for you, but he's not coming through too strongly." And I tried to think who would, I knew I could recall 2 Georges who were friends, but as far as I knew, they were still alive. And as it turned out, they were still alive at the time, but I couldn't figure out who she was talking about. And I kept shaking my head, and she couldn't get any more. She said, "Well, I'm sorry, he's just not coming through very well." So she went next to my wife, and said that I've also got a George for you on your father's side. I don't know if it's your father or somebody related to him, but he says he looks very much, or they say you look very much like him or resemble him. And then she stopped and corrected herself. She says, no, somebody says you resemble him. And that was very evidential to my wife, because her mother had always told her that she looks much more, she resembles her Uncle George more than she does her father.
Oh.
So that really struck home with her. I mean, she was very skeptical at the time, and more than anything else, that convinced her that not only the fact that Uncle George said that, but that the fact that the medium corrected herself and said that somebody said you look like her. So anyway, I went away that night feeling like I was the only failure. Everybody else in the room seemed to get some sort of evidential information. So we drove around the UK, up to Scotland, and around and through Wales, or down through Wales and back to London. Well, I decided I'm going to go back and try again. My wife decided to go shopping at can't even think of the name of the famous department store there. Anyway, but
Harrods or
I went
something.
Yeah, Harrods. And so I went back for a 3:00 reading at the Spiritual Association. This time with a different medium, an elderly lady who came in with a walker. She's about 80 years old, and she started the same way, giving readings to other people. And she came to me and she said, "There's somebody named George standing behind you.
Oh,
He's
no.
got his hands on your shoulders, and he's offering greetings." I shook my head again. I don't know who that would be. And she closed her eyes and she said, he's telling me he's a former colleague, and that he passed into spirit about 20 years ago of a blood-related disease. And then she said a few other very, evidential things. Something about he's glad you have a job now. He's been around you in your office, and he's glad you have a job you like. Well, it's still, I still couldn't get it to register. And it wasn't until I was going back to my hotel that it all came in, that there was a fellow employee at a place I worked some 20 years before, named George. I'm not going to say his last name for privacy reasons, but he after I left the company and went with another company, he died. I couldn't remember what he died of, but when I came back to Hawaii, I called a mutual friend, and he said he died of leukemia, a blood-related disease. Now people say, well, why didn't the skeptic says why didn't you just say leukemia? Why do you say blood-related disease? Because these clairvoyants, they're not getting they're usually getting it symbolically. So I don't know what the medium might have seen. She might have seen a figure of a body with blood circulating through the body or something like that. They're not getting the word leukemia, and for the same reason, he probably couldn't give his last name. Because there's no symbol for his last name that, at least any symbol that the medium knew. I remember watching one of the John Edward TV programs one time, and he said that when somebody named George came through, he'd see a picture of St. George on horseback. He had a symbolic picture to connect with various names. And so I guess that's what, this medium was doing. She got George pretty easily, but she couldn't get a last name. But the skeptics don't seem to understand that. They want him to be perfect, and, they assume they're like talking on a telephone to somebody and should be able to get every little detail rather than just, bits and pieces of information that might come through symbolically. So
I can't even imagine behind the scenes how they implant the memories and names and feelings into mediums here. So
right. I and it varies with the medium too. I mean, there's some clairaudient mediums who can get last names. They actually hear them, but there's just such a variety of mediums out there that it's hard. The skeptics want them to all be the same and all have the same ability, but I keep telling them it's like baseball players. I mean, you have baseball players you have Babe Ruth, and you have people who can't even make it to the majors, or are not good enough to make it, and then you have people in the major leagues who are not even close to the Babe Ruth type quality. Or since you're in Boston, I'll say Ted Williams or whatever. There's just various degrees of mediums with different abilities, and they're not all the same.
My mom always says, "What do you call the guy who graduated bottom of medical school?" And the answer is doctor. All different grades. Yep. And just because they have the title medium does not mean that they're perfect. And I think, we do the best we can. It's really great to know we do live on. We still are us, and they're not too far away. And I know for me, I live a different kind of life, believing in the afterlife. Do you feel the same way? How you live life is different?
Yeah. Much more positive. And, one of the primary reasons I write my books is to try and help people in their senior years. And that's when it hits home mostly. I mean, when you're young and, in a career and raising a family and so forth, you don't give it that much thought. I know I didn't. I mean, it wasn't until I turned, as I mentioned before, until I turned 50 that I think, I'm getting old. I've got to start thinking about this, and it just comes gradually. And I have so many friends who are, in their 70s and 80s that have just never given it any thought. Some of them are atheists, and some are, Christians, and they, the Christians just thinking about my parents are a good example. I mean, my mother was certain she was going to burn in purgatory for a few hundred years before she ever got to heaven. So that's what they were taught. And and I don't want to put down a Catholic Church. If I were to return to a church, I'd return to the Catholic Church before I'd become a Protestant, because they at least recognize a middle ground between heaven and hell. The Protestants, it's either heaven or hell, and no middle ground. I think that's the biggest thing that comes out of mediumship and spiritualism, is that there are many levels, between what religions call heaven and hell, and we don't go to, when we die, we don't go to the highest or the lowest. We go to whatever level we've prepared ourselves for. Professor Robert Hare, who was a chemistry professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1850s, he called it, or he was told by spirits, it's the best name for it is a mortal specific gravity, that all your good acts and all your bad acts, or whatever you want to call them, are all melded together at the end, and you, based upon that, you choose where you're going to go. You can't cheat on it. You can't say, well, I want to go to, if we can put it on 7 levels, which is sometimes done, that the lowest level is the earthbound level, or level 1, and the true heaven is 7th heaven, and the 7th level. If you can put it on that basis, then most people seem to go to the 3rd level, which spiritualists call Summerland, which, that's probably better called purgatory, if you want to, call the Catholics purgatory by another name. But it's not a fire. I mean, when I was a young Catholic student, we were told that purgatory was just as bad as hell, except it wasn't eternal. I think they're just avoiding. I've talked to other Catholics, and they say they just don't talk about it anymore. That they don't know what purgatory is, and the Catholic Church doesn't talk about life after death as much as they used to. So I don't know.
Every so often we hear someone talking about it. I think there was a priest that wrote a book about the afterlife. Can't really remember off the top of my head, but there are some. And it's interesting about the skeptics. When I first got involved with this, I wanted to tell everybody what I found out. And then I realized there's so many skeptics that want to fight me on it. And it's not my job at all to try to prove something to people. there are more people, a much higher percentage, that do believe in the afterlife, that are interested, and they'll find us. And so that's why I thought, you know what? I'll have these great conversations with great people, and I'll share with those who want to listen.
Right. That's my objective.
Yeah, because we can't push anything on anyone. What does the afterlife or Summerland, what is it like from the research that you've done? I know you said the 7 levels, but when we first get over, for me, I do believe that our loved ones are there and they're there to greet us. Do you have any thoughts for yourself from what you've gathered?
Well, I agree. I mean, the near-death experience tells us the same thing, that our loved ones are there to greet us, and that it's much more like what we're experiencing here in the material world, and we realize that the material world is just a replica of the spirit world. I find that difficult to comprehend, and I think the whole idea of the spirit world is beyond human comprehension. So I don't really go there that much. I'm satisfied to know that it's not just floating around in clouds and strumming harps and praising God 24/7 and I mean for eternity. I mean, you know, if that were the case, then total extinction would be preferable to me than than doing that. And I think that's the problem with atheism. Their beliefs are based upon what religion is taught. They don't know, if you talk to any of them, very few of them know about different levels between heaven and hell. I mean, they just know the heaven that's been taught to them in church. And I think the worst, or the best, worst, whatever you want to call them, atheists are those who were brought up in strictly religious homes. This stuff was drummed into them, and they get old enough to listen to some college professor that said, "Oh, none of that, all that stuff taught to you by your parents and priests and so forth was a bunch of baloney." So they become the best atheists. At least that's my observation.
And it doesn't really matter, because I think between you and me and those listening, once we get over there to the afterlife or hereafter, which I like using even more, we'll know.
Right.
Yeah. I think as a human being, Mike, it's really easy to live in the future and what if and what's going to happen. But someone wise once told me, because I'm 55 now, that everything I've done, like I've had the capacity to make decisions and to handle whatever comes my way. I have. I'm living proof of it, and as are you. So to spend any time worrying about how you're going to handle something when, like you say, I don't think human beings are meant to understand the bigger picture. We don't have the capacity for it. So to trust, once we get there, we'll handle it. It'll be okay. But I've talked to so many people who've had these near-death experiences. They say there's colors that we can't even fathom, but they could understand it with their consciousness, or music, or just the different levels of even being able to see, almost like in a 360 degrees behind you, in front of you, to the sides of you. We'll be able to handle it when our time comes.
Yeah. I like reincarnation, I just think it's beyond human comprehension. So as I said, I recognize I believe in reincarnation. I'm just not sure it plays out in the way that people think it does, or people who believe in it think it does. And the same thing with the afterlife, the same thing with God. I think one of the biggest problems we have today is people think you have to prove God before you can look at the afterlife.
Wow.
When you go to these debunking sites or the atheist sites, it's always you have proof of God. It's not proof of the afterlife. It's sort of a deductive approach. They say first you have to prove God, then we'll look at the afterlife. Well, my approach is the other way around. First you look at the evidence of the afterlife, and then you start thinking, well, what's behind it all? Is there God or a creative force or whatever behind it. And is it the same kind of God that religions teach? I don't know. I'm satisfied that there's evidence that's overwhelming evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, however you want to put it, that we do survive death. As far as how it plays out, what it is, what God is, I don't know. I still look to Jesus as sort of the chairman of the board on the other side, whether he is, quote, God, whatever God is. It doesn't really make that much difference to me. And most of the other things the churches teach, really, the virgin birth and whatever else. I mean, like, what difference does it make? So I just, first look at the evidence for survival, and that does it for me. The rest of it, I'll perhaps find out later. I mean, many of the spirit communicators say they've never seen God, never talked to God. They believe that, God is far beyond. They've got a long ways to go before they ever understand God. So I'm prepared to accept that.
They see a light most often.
Yep.
And unconditional love, which I can't even imagine how good that's going to feel.
Yep.
I think it's going to be just great. Well, we have a few minutes left, my new friend. Any thoughts coming to mind? What else you'd like to share?
Well, I do write a blog.
Okay.
And I've got about almost 300 blogs posted over the last 11 and a half years, I think. And if anybody's interested in it, they can just put my name into a Google search. And maybe I should, spell my name. As I said before, it's not Tim. It's Tymn. And a little story behind that I'll give is when my grandfather came from Ukraine to Brooklyn. The name was Tymczysyn, Tymczysyn.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, nobody could pronounce it, and it was always spelled wrong and so forth. So he was sitting in church one day and saw the word hymn, Hymn, up there. The hymns were going to be sung that day. So he said, "Well, that's close to my name, and I'll just, I'll make it Tim instead of him." And so that's what he and his brothers agreed. The name will be Tim, and they changed it, but people still messed it up. I mean, it comes out as Time or Tymon, whatever. So if you're looking for my blog or my books, if you put Michael Tymn, Tymn, into a Google search, you'll find them. But anyway, I had to get that in.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And if you're listening to this on YouTube right now, in the description, there is a live link to go check it out, because you are published with White Crow Books, right?
White Crow Books has published 6 of my books, yes.
Yeah, fantastic. I had thought of something great to say, and I've lost it. No, I haven't. It just came back. See what happens when we get older? You couldn't remember your things. It just happens. We remember what's important to us. We'll see it again. There's a great quote by Arthur Schopenhauer that's something like, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Secondly, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. And I think that the day will come, Mike, that people will believe in the afterlife like it's always been real. It'll be like, people laughed at the airplane when that was first coming about, and so many other things that are ridiculed. And then it's like, oh yeah, it's always been. Do you think that will happen? Maybe not in our lifetimes, but maybe that more people will believe than don't.
I think more people will, but I'm not sure that, we're supposed to know with absolute certainty that the afterlife does exist. I've often quoted Victor Hugo on that, and I don't have the quote right before me. I thought I had it here, but he was communicating after he was in exile on the island of Jersey, or, I think it was, he was communicating with the spirit of Martin Luther. And Hugo asked Luther, he says, "Why doesn't God better reveal himself? Why is there so much mystery?" And Luther responded that doubt is necessary for us to learn, to overcome adversity. If we knew definitely that there is a God, that there is an afterlife, we might not act. That free will would not play out in the same way it plays out right now. So that doubt is a big part of the divine plan. If everybody knew, no more doubt, I don't know what would happen if it all, if during periods of adversity they'd all kill themselves or whatever. I don't know what happened or how what would happen or how things would play out differently. But that's what Martin Luther supposedly told Victor Hugo, that doubt is necessary.
Yeah, good words. I know for myself, to go on my journey has made all the difference in the world. I didn't have to believe what somebody told me. I learned these things. I investigated it. For me, it's been 25 years now, and there's not a single soul who can tell me anything else because I've had these experiences. So while I don't push it on anyone, I do get some funny looks like, "Tell me everything. Why should I believe?" I'm like, "Can't do it." I can give you some, but you've got to go on your journey. And I think at some point when we get older, or if a loved one passes, we really start to look at that.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you for being our guest today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Time flew by. And for our listeners, thank you too for being with us. You may or may not know, we've got a lot of things happening online ever since COVID hit the world. We started doing a lot of things: mediumship classes, psychic classes, trance demonstrations every Friday. And then our Sunday gathering is not to be missed. It is a spiritual service with some prayers, with music, with a reading, with an address, but in each and every one is a mediumship demonstration. And we've got a couple of great mediums that work with our online audience, and to see the reunions that happen, it's just beautiful. So there's a free way to get involved. Our home base is wedon'tdie.com. If you scroll down to the bottom and you join my email list, there's a free copy of my book, We Don't Die, in PDF form if you'd like it. And there's also a very healing audio called How to Survive Grief. Grief is what brought me into this conversation, the death of some loved ones, and got me sharing what I know about the afterlife. And I found out that grief is a monster that we all go through, but there are ways to navigate it and deal with it. It's a process that we go through. So also chapter 10 of my book is How to Survive Grief. So in closing, I want to say thank you again to our friend Michael Tymn, Tymn, and to you, our listener. My name is Sandra Champlain. I've been your host on We Don't Die Radio. I do believe that life is an education for the soul, and that your life here on earth is important. I know I want to re-listen to this episode and jot down some of the names that Mike talked about and research some of those folks that lived between the 50s and 1920. Or that range anyways, and do some research. There's so much, and so many brilliant minds came together and witnessed a form of mediumship that is very, very rare here for us in 2021. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.